Rennick took hold of Hattie Wray's wrist so hard the ladle went into the dirt. I said, "My coffee's cold." He didn't raise his voice. That was the worst of it. He said it the way a man says "move, dog," without anger. Without even the courtesy of anger. Just the flat certainty that she did not matter enough to be angry at. Every man at that fire went quiet. Hattie did not pull away. She didn't cry. She stood there, 20 years old, her husband 6 months in the ground, her hands split from 6 weeks of fires lit before dawn, and she looked at the man holding her wrist the way you look at a piece of equipment someone has found fault with. And across the camp, a pair of dark eyes watched the whole thing. If you have ever stood in a room where someone treated you like you were nothing, and you had no choice but to stand there and take it, you already know exactly how she felt. What you don't know yet is what happened next. Let me take you back to a graveside in March, and a fire steel that had belonged to her mother, and an outfit of 30 men going up into the mountains who did not know yet what they had hired. The ground was still frozen the morning Hattie buried her husband. The men who dug had to break it with picks instead of shovels, and she remembered the sound of that more than anything. That sharp crack, over and over, like something being split that was never meant to be opened. She stood at the edge of the hole in her good blue dress and thought about practical things, because practical things were the only ones she could hold without coming apart. The left cuff wants mending. The wood is down to 4 days. I have $1.40. Daniel Ray had been 23, and good in the ordinary way people mean when they say a man was good. A horse threw him in December. He lasted 3 weeks. The neighbors were kind for as long as neighbors can afford to be. By April, the kindness had dried up the way a creek does. Not all at once. You just look one day and the water is gone. She asked at the dry goods store. They hired a boy from out of the valley. She asked at the boarding house. She asked at the freight office and got a look she would remember a long while, the look that says, "We were never going to hire you and I am too polite to tell you why." A 20-year-old widow with no family close, no skill anyone could see from the outside, and no man to speak for her was not the obvious choice for anything. What she could do was cook. She had been doing it since she was 8, standing on a stool at her mother's elbow in a Missouri kitchen. She could get 4 meals out of a ham bone. She could feed a crowd out of whatever happened to be there, and she never burned a thing twice. So when word went round that Abel Carrick's outfit was going up into the high country and wanted a cook, she hesitated exactly long enough to feel afraid. Then she put the fear where she put everything else that might undo her behind her ribs, pressed flat, and went to find the man hiring. She didn't meet Carrick. She met his second, a lean, weathered man named Gaines, who looked her over the way a man prices a mule. "You'd be cooking for 30 men. I'd be cooking for however many you've got." Gaines scratched his jaw. $12 a month. You ride the cook string. You don't ride anywhere else. You stay in camp. You keep the men fed, and you keep your mouth shut about anything that isn't a meal. He squinted at her. That agreeable? It wasn't wholly agreeable. But $1.40 wasn't going to carry her anywhere, and there was nowhere else to be. Yes, we pull out Thursday. She had one thing of her mother's. Not the good pot or the wedding ring, those had gone to the doctor. A fire steel, a plain curved striker worn thin at the grip, and an oilcloth pouch with charred cloth and dry shaved cedar in it. Her mother had carried one every day of her life and made Hattie start carrying one at 9. The thing you'll need worst, she used to say, is always the thing you forgot to put by. Hattie had found that tiresome at 11, sensible at 15, and true at 20 in a way that cost her something to learn. She put the steel in her apron pocket the morning they left and kept it there 4 months. The outfit went out Thursday. 30 men. 100 and some head of horses and mules, most of them loaded with a season's worth of traps and powder and lead and trade goods, headed 6 weeks west and up into country most of the men had seen and none of them had ever gotten comfortable in. The cook outfit was 3 mules and a set of panniers packed by whoever went before her, which is to say, packed badly. No notes, no count of what was aboard. She spent the first 6 hours of that march making a mental count. What existed, what did not, and how she was going to feed 31 people 3 times a day for 2 months on it. It wasn't plenty. It was enough if she was careful. She was careful. The men did not ignore her exactly. They ignored her the way you ignore furniture. Most of them did not use her name the first week. She was Hay, cook and girl. She learned their names anyway. Not to make friends because it helped. Which ones took coffee black? Which one had a bad tooth and couldn't chew anything hard? Which ones were homesick and wanted a bigger plate without having to ask? Nobody noticed. That was all right. She hadn't come out here to be noticed. Abel Carrick she saw at a distance most of that first week up the line, back with the loose stock, making the 100 small decisions a day that kept 100 animals and 30 men moving without anyone getting killed. Late 30s, she guessed. Dark hair well past his collar and going gray at the temples, a thick dark beard. No hat of any kind on his head at any hour she ever saw him. A face that had stopped being surprised by things some years back. He came to the fire like the rest of them, took his plate, ate fast, went away. He didn't make talk. Neither did she. The first time he actually looked at her, looked the way you look at a person and not at an obstacle, was the 4th morning, when she was up at 4:15 and he came to the fire an hour before anyone else. She didn't say anything. She handed him a cup. He took it, looked at her, looked at the fire, looked back at her, said nothing at all, drank it, walked away. She went back to the biscuits, but she noticed later, much later, she would be honest with herself about this, that when he walked away, he walked a little slower than he needed to. The trouble with Dutch Rennick was that he had been allowed to be Dutch Rennick for too long. He was a good trapper. She would give him that. And in that country, being good at the work brought a man much tolerance for everything else. He was loud the way makes other men go quiet, and that quiet had felt like respect to him so long he had forgotten there was a difference. He started in on her the 2nd week. Not dramatically. It never is. A plate pushed back across the pannier without a word, just a look that said again, and better. She reheated it. 1 difficult man in 30 was a reasonable ratio. Then his coffee, made wrong, though he wouldn't say how. Then the way she had the supplies laid out, which he rearranged without asking. And when she put them back where she could reach them, he did it again, and said, loud enough for the men nearby to hear, can't even keep a camp straight. The men nearby did not say anything. One of them looked at the ground. One found something interesting in the middle distance. Hattie kept her face very still because she had learned that a still face was the only reliable defense against a certain kind of man. You did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. You did not give them anything to aim at. You went blank, and you waited for it to pass. It kept coming. She found herself tracking him the way you track weather. Where was Dutch relative to the fire? Was anyone nearby? Were there witnesses? It was an exhausting way to live. She had been exhausted before. The night with the wrist was the 9th evening out. She had been awake since before 4. She had cooked in the dark, put out a cold noon meal off a moving mule, made camp, cooked supper for 31, and was scouring the last kettle when Dutch came back for a 2nd cup and found the pot off the boil. She was already reaching for it. He didn't wait. He took her wrist, not violently, which was the precise and horrible part. He took it the way you take hold of a door latch, without malice. and without the slightest notice that she was a person who might have feelings about being taken hold of. I said my coffee's cold. The camp went quiet. She heard the fire. She heard the stock somewhere out in the dark, that low, restless shifting they make at night. She heard the blood in her own ears. She didn't cry. She was silently furious at herself for the fact that the backs of her eyes were stinging, because she had not cried in front of another person since Daniel's funeral. She held, very still, and across the camp, Abel Carrick set down his cup. She didn't see him stand. She only knew he was there when Dutch's grip came off her wrist and a different silence dropped over the fire heavier. Aimed. Carrick was standing between them, not touching anyone. Not squared off in the showy way of men who want the look of a fight without being in one, just standing there, and the stillness around him was the stillness of something very large that has not started moving yet. Then he said, quietly, "You touch her again. You walk out. Not I'll fire you. Not you're out of line. Just you walk out." 4 words, delivered in a tone that made it wholly clear he meant them with the whole of his authority and had already decided he did not care what it cost him to do it. Dutch's jaw worked. Something moved across his face, an argument beginning, reconsidering itself, backing off. Coffee was cold, Dutch said, but the edge was gone out of it. Carrick did not answer. He stood there until Dutch took his cup and moved off. The camp breathed. Carrick turned and looked at her. Not with pity, not with the softness men sometimes offer women in such moments, which is only another kind of talking down. He looked at her the way you look at someone you are trying to read correctly, like a map in bad light. "You all right?" She became aware that she was holding her right wrist against her apron, and had been for some while, the way you do when a thing hurts, and you would rather not admit it. Yes. He didn't push it. He nodded once and went back to where he had been sitting. She reheated the coffee. Her hands were wholly steady, and she was enormously proud of that in the private way of people who have no one to tell. She carried a cup to Dutch without a word, because she needed the job. But later, scouring the last kettle alone in the dark, she sat with it. Not the ugly part. She had had enough of that. The other part. You touch her again, you walk out. Daniel had loved her, but Daniel had been gentle and young, and his protection had always felt like something offered, something she had to receive carefully and be grateful for. What she had heard tonight was not offered. It had simply happened, the way a man walks to the edge of a drop and stands there, not performing courage, just not much concerned with the drop. She had spent 9 days being invisible to Abel Carrick. She was beginning to think she had been wrong about that. She made biscuits the next morning without thinking about Dutch Rennick at all. That was a choice, and it took work. The baking powder was old, and they came out flat. She didn't apologize for them, because excusing for what you cannot control is a waste of breath. Carrick took his plate and stood a few feet off the way he did, eating fast, not tasting, just fueling. She was watching the sky in the east, working out how long she had before the string needed to move, when he set his empty plate down and said, without any lead-up at all, "How's your wrist?" She looked at him. "Fine. I'm not asking to be polite." "I know," she said. "It's fine." He held her eyes half a second longer than he needed to. Then he picked up his rifle from where he had leaned it and walked away. That was the whole talk. It should not have meant as much as it did. She knew it should not have meant as much as it did, and she went back to scrubbing the pannier lid with the focused energy of a woman who is not thinking about a talk. The country climbed. The days took a shape. Up at 4. Fire by 1/4 past. Coffee by 1/2 past. By first light, the loads were on and the string was moving. She learned to work standing in a pannier rig with the mule walking under her, and only came off once the second week, when a mule shied and put her sideways into the rocks. She bruised her hip badly enough that sitting hurt 3 days. She told no one. She changed the way she stood. Supper was the meal that mattered, and she put everything she had into it. Not to impress anyone, because she knew what a hot meal means to a tired person. She had been tired long enough to know food is more than fuel. It tells you the day was bearable. She made extra cornbread when she saw the 2 youngest boys, 17 and 19, away from home the first time, eating less than the rest. The way people eat when they are too lost to be hungry. She set their plates aside and handed them over so she could see they got enough. Neither said anything. They ate. Their color came back inside a week. She started fixing things, too. The first was a torn seam in a coat belonging to a quiet man named Sim, who had been wearing it open 3 days because he had no needle. She had a needle. She mended it while he ate and set it on his bedroll without a word. He looked at it in the morning. His eyes found her. He nodded once. She nodded back. 2 days later, a shirt turned up missing a button. Then gloves wanting a thumb. She didn't advertise it. She did it when it was there to be done, the same way she did everything. Carrick noticed. She was beginning to suspect he noticed most things. He came to the fire one evening and stood there longer than usual. She was mending a bedroll cover by firelight, which was harder than it looked and made her eyes ache. "You don't have to do that." "I know. Gaines didn't hire you to sew. Gaines hired me to keep the men fed and working." She bit the thread. A man with a coat open at the seam in 40-degree weather isn't working. A pause. She heard him shift his weight. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" She looked up, because the question surprised her. Not a compliment. She had had a few of those, the generic kind men offer when they mean don't change anything. This was an actual question. "My mother. She said you could make a good thing out of near anything if you paid attention to what you had instead of wishing for what you didn't." Smart woman. She was. Past tense. He caught it and decided not to ask. "You stretch supplies better than the last one did," he said instead. "I'm saying it's noticed. I'm not sure enough people have said so." She looked back at her needle. Most people don't notice the things that keep them alive. They just stay alive and assume it was going to happen anyway. Carrick made a sound that might have been a quiet laugh. "That's accurate," he said. She showed him the fire steel 8 days later, though showing was not what she meant to do. They had made a cold noon halt, and she had a small fire going in 4 minutes, and Carrick stopped and looked at it, and then at her hands. "That's an old steel. It was my mother's." She held it out. He turned it over the curve worn thin where 4 decades of thumbs had rested, the oilcloth pouch with its char and shaved cedar. "I carry charcloth, cedar and fatwood in the bottom pannier." My mother's rule. The thing you'll need worst is always the thing you forgot to put by. That's a good rule. It's an annoying rule. You keep it every day for the one day it matters, and most days it doesn't, and it makes you feel foolish. And then it matters. And then it matters. He handed the pouch back and went up the line, and she thought no more about it for 6 days. Then the storm came. She felt it in the afternoon before she saw it. The way the air changed. The way the wind shifted twice in an hour and then quit altogether in that plain dead calm that means something is gathering itself. She had grown up in Missouri and spent the last month climbing into country that made Missouri weather look like a rumor. She knew what that stillness meant, and she started getting ready without telling anyone. You couldn't stop the weather. What you could do was protect what was protectable. She repacked the cook panniers, everything water could ruin, into the middle. and she got out her fat wood and her cedar and the dry pieces she had been picking up every time they passed through timber, and wrapped the lot of it tight and put it in the driest corner of the load. Nobody asked what she was doing. She was the cook. She was always doing something that did not concern them. It hit at dusk with none of the build-up weather sometimes offers as a courtesy. 1 minute there was a low iron line on the ridge. 20 minutes later the wind was horizontal and it was sleet turning to snow, and the whole sky had decided to lean on them and push. The stock went sideways at once. Men who had been easy 10 minutes ago were running and shouting to hold 100 animals together in the dark. Fires went flat. Shelters came apart. Hattie got the cookloads lashed down with the last of the ties, and then stood in the wind and looked at what was left of the camp and started thinking about what was possible. A normal fire was not coming back tonight. Not in that wind. But she had dry wood, and her mother's steel, and the big cast-iron kettle, heavy enough to stay where she put it, and 3 sides of a rock outcrop for a windbreak. It wasn't a fire she was building. It was something smaller and more stubborn, just enough flame under the kettle keeping the flame off the wind, the whole setup barely working and working enough. It took 40 minutes and everything she had. The char caught on the 4th strike. She sheltered it with both hands and her own body and fed it cedar shavings the width of a hair and did not breathe until it took. By the time the men started coming in off the stock in small, exhausted knots, she had coffee. Hot coffee. Not good coffee, she had guessed at the water, because measuring was out of the question, but hot in there. And she had the small pot of beans she had started that afternoon back up to a simmer, which meant food was coming too. The first man in was Tully, the 17-year-old, wet through, his hands shaking hard enough to see from 6 feet. He stopped when he saw the fire. That small, impossible, stubborn little fire. How? Dry cedar, she said. Cup. He took it with both hands and held it against his chest before he ever drank from it. She watched him do that and looked away before it could mean too much. They kept coming. She kept pouring. She ran out of cups, and men drank from whatever they had. Carrick came in near midnight, soaked through, his face with the controlled blankness of a man who has been managing a disaster for hours and is still managing it inside even though the worst is past. He stopped the same way Tully had stopped, with the same fractional pause. He looked at the fire, at the kettle, at her. She was soaked herself, her hair out of its pins some hours ago. A burn across the back of her left hand from when the lid slipped while she was working by feel in the dark. She poured him a cup. He took it. There was no dry wood in this camp, he said quietly. There is now. You put it by. I put something by, she said. I told you the rule. He drank his coffee. He stood there by that small fire a moment longer than he needed to, and his face was doing something she couldn't wholly read in the light. Something that was not the closed blankness she had gotten used to. The men need to know this wasn't luck, he said. It doesn't matter what they think it was. It matters to me, Carrick said. She had nothing ready for that. She looked at the fire instead and adjusted something that did not need adjusting. You should eat. Beans are thin. I had to stretch them. I've eaten worse. He took his beans, and he sat down nearby instead of going back to his usual place across the camp, and she found herself aware of that in the same unexamined way you are aware of warmth, not thinking about it directly, just feeling it at the edge of everything else. She was still serving at 2 a.m. She would be up again at 4. She didn't mind. She hadn't always known she was good at things. Daniel had told her, and she had half believed him. Because you always half believe the people who love you. You assume they are being kind. Out here, with 30 strangers, in a storm, in the middle of nowhere, she was finding it out for herself. That was different. That was hers. The sun came out the next morning bright and cold and indifferent, the way it does after those storms, like nothing happened. The camp was a wreck. Gear was scattered. 2 mules had pulled loose in the night and had to be hunted, which put Gaines in a mood dark enough to cast its own shadow. But the men ate a hot breakfast, and they ate it in the focused silence of people who were very hungry and very grateful, and not quite ready to say so out loud. Dutch Rennick sat at the far edge of camp that morning. He took his plate without looking at her and said nothing. What she felt, and she examined it carefully, because it was unfamiliar, was something like being seen. Not in the spectacular way, more like 2 or 3 people in this camp were now looking at her with their actual eyes instead of through her like a window. Carrick, young Tully. Sim with his mended coat. Rafe, who had started leaving firewood near the cook panniers in the evenings without being asked, just setting it there like it was nothing. She was 20 years old and alone in the world, and she had spent 8 months being invisible in one degree or another. The feeling of being seen, even a little, even by exhausted trappers who couldn't quite remember her name, was not nothing at all. Carrick fell into the habit of coming to the fire first in the morning and staying till the men came. Those 10 or 15 minutes were the quietest part of her day, and she was beginning to realize the part she organized the rest of the morning around without admitting it. Some mornings they talked. Practical things. Some mornings they did not talk at all, and stood in the early dark with their coffee and listened to the stock shifting. Those mornings she liked best and was most suspicious of. 3 weeks out, he told her about his children. She hadn't asked. She never asked. But he came to the fire in a mood that was different from usual, not darker, heavier, the way someone moves when a thing is pressing on them from the inside, and after a while he said, unprompted, "My girl turns 8 next week. I keep thinking on it." Hattie looked at him. "You have children." 2. Ivy's near 8. Wes is 9. They're with my sister at Rimrock while I'm out. Every season? Since their mother passed. 3 years back. I'm sorry. She said it because she meant it specifically, with the knowing of someone who knew what that kind of loss does to the air around a man standing in the dark at 5 in the morning. Ivy doesn't sleep right, he said. Wes does. But Ivy. He stopped. I get letters from my sister. She doesn't say it outright. He drank. It's harder to be gone than it used to be. Then why do you go? Because the place doesn't run without money, and the money doesn't come without the season, and those kids need the place to still be there when they're old enough to run it. Their grandfather cut the first logs. I'm not going to be the one that loses it. That's a lot to carry by yourself. Most things worth carrying are heavy, he said. She was not sure when she had started looking forward to the mornings. She was quite sure she wasn't going to say so to anyone. 2 days after the storm, Dutch Rennick made one more attempt. Not at her directly. He said something to the man beside him at supper, loud enough to carry, about women in the mountains being bad luck. About how the storm proved it. About how some people ought to stay down in the settlements where they belonged. He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't have to. Carrick was on the other side of the fire. He didn't move. He didn't look at Dutch. He said, in the same calm voice she had heard him use on a horse about to bolt low. Absolute, with no air in it for negotiation. Dutch. Stop. That was it. 2 words. Dutch stopped. She served the rest of supper without any of the men meeting her eyes, which she knew. They were embarrassed, and men have a hard time with embarrassment that has no target they can hit. Later, cleaning up alone, she thought about it. The once could be about pride or authority. The twice was about something else. The fire came on a Thursday. She didn't see it start. She smelled it first, the specific smell of burning timber and dry duff, thinner and faster than a cook fire, with a heat under it that seems to arrive before the fire does. She was at the panniers on the midday halt, and she lifted her head, and the hair came up on her arms before her mind had finished the arithmetic. The smoke was already a line down the slope, pale and low and moving fast. The wind had been out of the southwest all morning, and it was pushing whatever was burning straight up the drainage at them. She didn't stand there, looking at it. "Fire!" she shouted. "Fire!" below. The camp came apart. The stock smelled it seconds after she called. The sound of them changed instantly from the low murmur of animals at rest to something formless and urgent, like a crowd that has heard bad news and hasn't yet decided what to do with it. Then they decided. 100 head of horses and mules going up the trail at once, away from the smoke. Anyone who has seen stock run in that country knows you don't stop them from the front. Gaines went past her at a dead run with the face of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like. She looked at the cook loads. And then at the loads beside them, the powder. 6 kegs of it, and the lead and the caps, stacked where they had come off at the halt. If the fire reached that, the second explosion would be worse than the first. She got the 2 nearest mules by the halters and hauled them around, and they did not want to come. She put everything she had into holding them and turning them and talking to them in the low, unbroken voice she had learned worked better than shouting. Just sound. Just presence. She got the powder 80 yards up the slope onto bare shale, dropped the leads, and turned around. And the wind had shifted. Not wholly, just enough. The fire was angling now, and the angle it took led across the bench where Abel Carrick had been trying to turn the head of the string. She saw his horse go down. The horse was there, and then it was not, and Carrick was in the air, and then he was on the ground, and the string was going to be on him in about no time at all. She moved before she decided to move. Afterward, she would try to reconstruct it and find she could not. There was no thought behind it. She had simply started running 20 yards to the panniers, hand into the near one, out with the long coiled whip Gaines used on the string. She had never used a whip. She knew the mechanics the way she knew the mechanics of many things she had never done. From watching. From the habit of learning things before you need them, because needing them first is too late. The fear was there. She was not fearless. She wanted that on record, even if the record was only in her own head. She was wholly terrified. She threw it. The first attempt was a disaster. The tip did not pop. She adjusted. Wrist, elbow, the drive from the shoulder. The second crack was enormous. Not loud the way thunder is loud, but in that thin air, in front of 100 running animals whose only guidance was panic, it was enough. Sharp and sudden, and nothing at all like fire. She cracked it again. And again, moving sideways along their line, at the edge of where they were running, not in front, never in front, her arm burning from the third stroke. Her voice raw from shouting things she couldn't hear herself say. The leaders pushed right. It was ragged and terrible, animals still pouring past on both sides of her, close enough that she felt the heat coming off them. Close enough that she was one stumble from the worst possible place. She didn't stumble. She held her ground and cracked the whip and felt the string move. Reluctantly, imperfectly, enough the main body swung east and poured down past the outcrop in a river of hooves and panic, and she was at the edge of it. And Carrick was not under them. She saw him at the edge of the bench, on his feet, one hand pressed to the side of his head, blood dark at his temple. Upright, looking at her. She let the whip down. Her arm did not feel like her arm. The fire died on the eastern edge where the timber thinned to rock, the way fires do when you stop giving them what they want. Men on horseback worked the flanks and brought the string to a slow, exhausted halt half a mile up. Hattie stood in the settling smoke and breathed, and the breathing hurt, and she became aware of the back of her left hand. The same hand she had burned in the storm. Burned again now, this time from a spark she must have caught somewhere in the last few minutes without noticing. She noticed now. She pressed it against her apron and stood very still, because if she moved, she might go down, and she wasn't going to go down. Carrick came across the flattened ground toward her with the careful movement of a man who suspects something is wrong with his balance and is not going to admit it yet. He stopped in front of her and looked at her a long moment, the way he had looked at her that first time by the fire, reading her. "Your hand. It's fine. It's not fine." He reached out and took her wrist. Gently, deliberately, nothing at all like the way Dutch had done it. He turned her hand palm up. The burn was red across the back and blistering in one place. "There's salve in the kit." "I know where the kit is," she said. "It's my pannier." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something that acknowledged the situation without getting sentimental about it. "Right," he said. He didn't let go of her wrist right away. Gaines came back through the smoke at a trot, scanning, adding up damages. He pulled up when he reached them. He looked at Hattie. He looked at the whip still coiled in her good hand. He looked at Carrick. "She turned the string," Carrick said. Gaines looked at her again. With that. Gaines was not a man who showed surprise. His face had weathered into a flatness that made emotion hard to locate. But something moved across it. He nodded once, slowly, and rode on without another word. She knew that was, from Gaines, a standing ovation. They lost 4 head. 1 mule had to be put down. Nobody was killed. In a run of that size with fire driving it, that was not luck. She could see the release of it in Carrick's face when he came to the fire that evening, the release of a man who has been holding an outcome in his hands for hours and can finally set it down. He sat down across from her, which he had never done. He usually stood. He held his coffee in both hands and looked at the flames and said nothing for a while. She left him to it. "Where'd you learn to use a whip?" he said finally. "I didn't." He looked at her. "What?" "I'd never had one in my hand before today." He stared at her. This was, she had learned over these weeks, the Carrick equivalent of an open mouth. You turned 100 head with a tool you'd never used. I'd watched Gaines. I knew the mechanics. That is not, he stopped. Set his coffee down. Picked it back up. There's a gap between knowing how a thing works and doing it in front of running stock. "Yes," she said. "There is." He looked at her a long moment. "Were you scared?" She thought about lying. Not to deceive him, just the reflex. The one she had built over months of trying to look more solid than she was, of not wanting to give anyone a reason to see her as breakable. She didn't lie. Completely, she said. Something in his face shifted. "And you did it anyway. You were going to die," she said simply. So, he was quiet in a way that was different from other quiet. "I need to ask you something." "All right." He looked at the fire, not at her. "Ivy still wakes up at night. Wes keeps everything inside. They need someone who's going to stay, not someone passing through." He paused. "I've been thinking about Rimrock. About what that place is and what it isn't." She waited. "I'm not saying this correctly." "I know what you're saying," she said. And she did. "I don't know enough about you. You know more than you think. Then tell me something I don't know." It wasn't a demand. It was the question of a man genuinely asking. "I loved my husband," she said. "And I'm done grieving him. I'm not done missing him. That's a different thing, and I think it lasts longer. But I'm not someone waiting to get back what I had. What I had is over. Whatever comes next is something else." He nodded slowly. "I'm not going to pretend I know what being a mother is," she said. "I don't have children. I'm 20 years old. I spent 8 months learning how not to starve, and today I turned 100 head with a whip I'd never held. I don't know what I'm capable of. I'm still finding out. You're finding out quickly. I'm being given much material to work with. My children are difficult. he said. Ivy especially. She doesn't trust easy. Neither do I. I know, he said. And there was something in the way he said it. Not I've noticed that about you. But I know, because I'm the same. The outfit came down into the post at Sweetgrass 6 weeks and 4 days out, and the mood shifted the way it always does near the end of a long thing. Hattie made the best supper she could out of what remained, which was thin. She had been stretching things 10 days with the focused creativity of a woman who takes a problem personally. The kettle went wholly empty for the first time in a week. She was scouring it when Dutch Rennick materialized at the edge of her workspace. Good supper, he said. There was no warmth in it. It came out the way a man talks when he has been made to say a thing and is saying it with the least investment possible. Thank you, she said, flat and even, the tone she would use for a weather report. His jaw worked over something. You're all right on a trail. It cost him. She could see the cost. Not remorse, the sourness of a man who has been made to recalibrate and resents the backing down. She didn't soften. She didn't reassure him. She had spent 7 weeks protecting her wrist and her dignity with very little help, and she was not obligated to make his almost apology comfortable. Good night, Dutch, she said, and turned back to her work. Later, with the fire low and the men gone to their beds, Carrick came to the cook fire. She was making her count the habit she had kept since the first day. Baking powder's gone wholly, she said without turning. I'll want more before anything else. I know, I was going to ask you to add to the resupply list. I already wrote it down. She turned and handed him the folded paper she had been keeping in her apron pocket for 2 days. He took it. Looked at it. His eyebrows moved the closest he came to being visibly impressed. This is thorough. It's my job to know what we need. He folded it and put it in his coat. He didn't leave. She waited. You spoke to Dutch tonight. He spoke to me. What'd he say? That supper was good, and that I was, quote, all right on a trail. A pause. That's as close to an apology as Dutch gets. I gathered. I didn't ask for it. No, Carrick said. You didn't. He was looking at her with that reading expression again. You never ask for anything. I ask for things, she said, a little defensively. I asked for the baking powder. That's for the men. She opened her mouth, closed it. He had her there, and they both knew it. She didn't ask for things for herself. That was accurate. It was a habit so deep she barely noticed it, the careful minimizing of her own needs so that no one could use them against her. So no one could call her a burden or a problem or more trouble than she was worth. There's something I want to say to you, he said. I've been trying to find the right way for about a week, and I don't think there is one, so I'm going to say it plain. She waited. I want you to come to Rimrock, he said. Not as the cook. He stopped, organized himself. I'm asking you to come as my wife, if that's a thing you'd consider. The fire popped somewhere behind her. A horse shifted in the dark. Everything else went quiet with the totality of quiet that happens when your ears are suddenly trying to hear something other than what was just said. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not performing anything. No knee, no speech, no attempt to make the moment bigger than it was. He was standing in front of her the way he stood in front of everything directly, weight even, ready to deal with whatever came next. You don't know me well enough for that, she said. The first thing her mouth found. I know you better than I've known most people after a year, he said. I've watched you work 7 weeks in conditions that broke men twice your size, and you never stopped. The one time a man put his hands on you, you stood there with more dignity than I could have. Then you saved my life. He paused. What am I missing? I'm 20 years old. I know how old you are. You're what? 38, 37, he said. I know what it is. I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't what it is. I'm asking whether it matters enough to be the deciding thing. She looked at her hands. The bandage on the left was fresh. She thought about Daniel, which she had not done on purpose in days, and which felt like a real thing to notice. She thought about the blue dress, and $1.40, and a boy from out of the valley hired for a job she could have done better. She thought about a girl who did not sleep, and a boy who kept things inside. "Tell me about Ivy," she said. "Something real, not the summary." He sat down on a crate. Sat down, which she noticed. "She won't come to me when she has the nightmares. She told my sister she doesn't want to wake me, because I've got too much to worry about already." Hattie closed her eyes half a second. 7 years old and already managing her father's load. Already deciding her own fear was the less important thing. "She sounds like me," she said. "I know. That's part of why I'm asking. I'm not going to be easy to live with," she said. "I need to say that plain. I have a temper when I see something unfair. I don't ask for help when I should. I form opinions fast, and I'm usually right, and I'm not especially humble about it. All right. I mean it. I'm not being modest. I'm telling you specifically. I've been married before," he said. "I know what not easy looks like, and I know what it's worth when someone's honest about it up front. I'm not easy either. I go quiet when I should talk. I work too much. The place comes first. And I know that's a real thing to tell someone. At least you know it. Doesn't fix it." "No," she agreed. "But it's better than not knowing." They sat with that a moment. The honest count of two imperfect people looking at each other across a supply crate in the dark, which was not the setting of any story about romance she had ever heard, and which felt, for that reason, more real than anything she could have invented. "I need to think about it. Take whatever time you need. I might say no." "I know," he said, steadily, without using the steadiness to press her. "That's why I asked instead of assuming." The outfit's last gathering was the following evening, in the yard behind the post store, before the men scattered, some going back down, some on to the next outfit. The inevitable dissolution that happens at the end of every long haul when the shared purpose that made 30 strangers into something like a company is over. Carrick was standing by the fire in the yard, and then Dutch Rennick laughed. It wasn't the laugh of a man who has heard something funny. It was the specific laugh of a man who wants a yard's attention and has chosen the cheapest way to get it. It came after Carrick said something quiet to the man next to him and then glanced at Hattie, where she stood at the edge of the group. Dutch had been watching for exactly that. "The cook," he said loudly, the laugh underneath it. "He's looking at the cook." He let it land. What's a man like Carrick want with a plain little cook from nowhere? He shook his head like the idea itself was the punchline. That's something. The yard went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being tactful, the specific quiet of people who are watching a thing and have not yet decided what part they are playing in it. She felt heat come up the back of her neck. Not embarrassment. Anger, the clean, bright anger of someone who has been looked at and found wanting by a person with no standing to judge. She didn't speak. She stood where she was and kept her face still and waited, because she had learned weeks and miles ago that she didn't have to fill every silence. Carrick turned and looked at Dutch with the unhurried care of a man choosing his moment. "You want to say something?" Not loud. The quiet was doing the work. Dutch shrugged. The performance of a man who believes he has the room. "I'm just saying what everybody's thinking. No offense to the girl, I'm going to stop you there." Carrick did not step forward or raise his voice. He stood where he was and looked slowly around the group, making eye contact with the men nearest him. And then he began to talk. He talked about the storm on the 19th day, and the fire that should not have been possible, and the coffee that was hot when it had no right to be, and what that meant to 30 exhausted men who came in out of the dark and found something warm waiting. He talked about the mended coats, about the extra plates set aside for 2 boys too far from home to remember to eat, about the supply list that accounted for everything before anyone thought to ask, and the way she had stretched 12 days of stores into 17. Then he talked about the fire. She moved the powder when no one told her to, he said. I didn't think about the powder. She did. He let that sit. Then she picked up a whip she had never held and walked out in front of 100 head of running stock, because I was on the ground. Nobody in that yard moved. She was scared, Carrick said. I asked her. She told me the truth. She was wholly terrified, and she did it anyway, because that's what she does. That's what she's been doing since the first morning out. He paused. I've run 7 of these. I've worked with some of the best hands in this country, and the most reliable person on this outfit, the most prepared, the one who held this camp together when everything else was coming apart, was Hattie Wray, who got paid $12 a month and never once asked for more. He looked at Dutch. That's who you're laughing at. Dutch's face was doing several things at once, none of them comfortable. Now, Carrick said to the group, I've asked this woman to come to Rimrock as my wife. She hasn't answered, which is her right, but every man here should know that if she says yes, she comes as my equal and the mistress of that place. And if any of you has an opinion about that, keep it. He looked back at Dutch, including you. Dutch opened his mouth. And Dutch, Carrick said, you're done. Go to Gaines in the morning and take your wages. You'll not go out with this outfit again. There was a silence. Over a cook, over the fact that I told you 9 weeks ago what would happen if you put your hands on her. Carrick said, and I've watched you spend every day since looking for a way to do the same thing without using your hands. You found one tonight. He turned away. You walk out. Same as I said. Dutch Rennick stood in that yard a moment with 30 men looking at him and nothing left to say. And then he went. She didn't watch him go. Sim took off his hat. It was a small thing. Nobody told him to. He just did it, the way people do when they want to mark a moment and have no words for it. A few of the others did the same, one at a time, without discussing it. Tully was looking at her with his honest young face wholly open. No subtlety, no management. He looked like someone watching a thing he intends to remember. Hattie stood at the edge of the firelight and felt something move through her that she had no name for. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. But her eyes were doing something she was not in control of, and she let them. Because there are only so many walls you can hold at once. She looked at Abel Carrick across the fire. He looked back. He was not waiting for anything from her. He had said his piece. What happened next was hers. She thought about a boy with a book of feed figures and a girl who wouldn't wake her father because he had too much to worry about already. She thought about what it meant to be seen, really seen, by someone who did not need her to be anything but exactly what she was. She had been moving away from something for 8 months, and she was tired of moving away. It was time to move toward. Yes, she said. Not loudly. She said it clearly, across the fire, to the only person it was meant for. He heard her. The yard broke into noise. Not celebration, just the sound of men who are glad about a thing and not sure how to be glad quietly. Rafe started something on the harmonica. Tully made a sound that was mostly laughter. Carrick crossed the yard. He stopped in front of her. Up close she could see he was not emotional exactly. He was a man for whom emotion lived 2 layers down and surfaced in small specific ways, but his eyes were doing something. You're sure? Not pressing. Checking, I'm not sure about anything, she said honestly, but yes. He looked at her a moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He put out his hand, the way you offer a handshake. like a partnership. She took it. They shook once, firm and serious, and she felt something in it more intimate than many things that look more intimate, the contact of two people who mean what they are agreeing to. "All right, then," he said. "All right," she said. His hand did not let go right away. Neither did hers. They were married 9 days later at Sweetgrass by a circuit man, in a room that smelled of ink and boot leather, with Gaines as witness. No flowers. She wore the cleanest dress she owned, which was not the blue one. She had left that folded on a shelf in a rented house in Missouri because she couldn't wear it and couldn't throw it away, and leaving it had felt like the honest thing. Then they went to Rimrock. The valley came up out of a morning like a door opening on a room you had not known was there. Timber on the shoulders, a creek running black down the middle, the mountains behind it plainly enormous. The house was square and plain and real, with smoke standing straight up out of the chimney, because his sister Hester had been told to expect them and had put a fire in. Somebody had bothered. That hit Hattie somewhere under the ribs in a way she had not braced for. She kept her face still. Old habit. Hester came out before the horses stopped. "You're smaller than I expected. I get that. Abel says you turned 100 head with a whip. I'd never used one before." Hester looked at her brother. "I like her," she said, and went back inside, which was the whole of the greeting, and which Hattie found she liked very much. Wes was standing in the middle of the front room, holding himself like someone older. Shoulders back, chin level, trying to look fine. She knew the posture. She had worn it 8 months. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Wes. Your father told me about your book." Something went through his face. Surprise, then real interest overriding the readiness. "He told you about that?" "He said you started it at 7. That's practical. I like practical." He didn't answer. But the practiced stillness shifted a little, and she let it shift and moved on, because the worst thing you can do with a child holding himself carefully together is push on the seams. Ivy was not in the room. Hester tilted her head toward the hall, and Hattie knew. The bedroom. Choosing not to come out. She didn't go after her. Ivy appeared in the doorway partway through supper. Smaller than Hattie had pictured. Dark hair, her father's eyes exactly the reading kind. Socks and no shoes, which meant she had been lying on her bed. Hattie looked at her directly and said nothing. Not coldly. She didn't look away or pretend she had not seen her. She looked at her the way you look at someone whose pace you are willing to let set the thing. Ivy looked back. Where Wes had measured, "Is this person useful?" Ivy's question was harder. "Is this person going to stay?" Hattie held her eyes and did not perform warmth she was not yet entitled to perform. Ivy came to the table and sat down. Hester passed her the bread, without commentary. She ate. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was a child coming to the table because she was hungry and the food was there, and the person who was going to be in her house was sitting in it, without trying to take it over. That was enough for tonight. Ivy took longer. Hattie did not try to make her love her. You do not make children love you. You exist in a way that makes love eventually possible. And you do it whether the child is watching or not. And you do not punish them for the time it takes. So she was there. She kept the house warm at night because she had found the child cold once without the child knowing she was cold, and said nothing about it in the morning. She said nothing the second time either. Or the third. The fever came in the 6th week. Hattie woke to a change in the air the way a house sounds different when something in it is wrong. Carrick was already awake beside her. "Ivy," he said. Just the name. She was out of bed before he finished. The child was burning. Not warm burning, the skin tight and dry, the dark eyes not focusing. "I know," Hattie said, without knowing what the child had said. "I know. It's all right." It wasn't all right. And she was not performing calm for anyone's benefit. She was using calm because panic is useless, and she did not have the luxury of it. She had learned that in a storm and in a fire. She sent Carrick for cold water and cloths and told him to build the fire up because warmth was going to matter once the fever broke, and where to find the kit she had added to at Sweetgrass, knowing she was coming north and a doctor was a long way off. He did it without asking why, which she was grateful for, because the thing that helps most in a crisis is not having to explain yourself. Wes appeared in the doorway around midnight, with his practical face on and something younger under it. "She's going to be all right," Hattie said. "I need you to sleep. I'm not tired, I know. Go anyway." He stood there. "Are you sure?" he said. Very quietly. She looked at him. 9 years old, keeping his father's figures, keeping his own feelings folded up, working hard to sound like he was asking a practical question. She saw all of it. She had the same habit in herself. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure." He went. Carrick stayed. He didn't sleep. She could feel his wakefulness from the chair, the tension of a man who knows the right thing is to let someone else handle this and is finding the letting difficult. She let him sit there. She changed the cloths when they warmed. She got water into the child every time she surfaced. She talked to her in the low, unbroken voice she had used on terrified stock. Not words that needed knowing. Just sound. Just presence. "I am here, and I am not going anywhere." The fever broke around 4. She knew before she checked the breathing changed. The awful tight heat, releasing the way it does when a body decides to come back from wherever it was going. Hattie sat there and felt the relief go through her like something physical. She was not the child's mother. Ivy had had a mother, and that mother was gone, and nothing was going to fix it. She was not here to replace what was lost. She was here to be something else. Something additional. She didn't have a word for it. Maybe there is not one, because it is a thing you build over time rather than name up front. Ivy woke properly at dawn, clear-eyed and exhausted and slightly embarrassed, the way sick people are when they come back to themselves and realize how helpless they were. Hattie was still sitting there. She hadn't slept. "You stayed," Ivy said. It wasn't quite a question. "Of course." Ivy looked at her a long moment with those reading eyes. "My hair's sticky," she said finally. "You had a fever. I'll help you wash it if you want." "All right," Ivy said. It wasn't an apology. It was a 7-year-old asking, in the only way she was ready to ask, whether the person beside her was willing to do a small, ordinary, intimate thing that required some level of trust. She was not good at it. She had never washed a child's hair. She got water in Ivy's eyes once, and Ivy made a sound of annoyance, and Hattie apologized without over-excusing and tried again. She worked the tangles out with her fingers the way her own mother had done with hers. Slowly, without pulling. Ivy sat still for it. Carrick was in the doorway. She knew without looking, and she did not look. She kept working, aware of the whole house as a single thing she was now part of. That was the day it changed. Not all at once. But Ivy let the distance dissolve after that morning, the way a thing does when it has served its purpose, and what grew in the space it left was slow and imperfect and real. The first winter was serious in the way Montana winters are serious. The night she gave Ivy the fire steel was the coldest of that winter, 31 below, and the wind coming off the high country like something with an opinion, and everybody in the front room, because it was the only place worth being. Ivy had been watching her build the fire back up. "How do you always get it going?" "It takes Papa longer." "Because I put things by." She got the pouch out of her apron and unrolled it on the hearth, the steel worn thin at the grip, the char cloth, the shaved cedar, the fat wood. "This was my mother's." She carried it every day of her life and made me start carrying one when I was 9. She turned it over. The rule is you keep it every single day, for the one day it matters. And most days it doesn't matter, and you feel foolish carrying it. And then there's a night in a blizzard with 30 men coming in wet, and there's no dry wood anywhere in that camp, and you've got a pocket full of cedar you cut 3 weeks ago for no reason at all. Ivy's eyes had gone very wide. You did that? I did that. Hattie folded the oilcloth over and held it out. It's yours. Ivy did not take it. It's your mother's. It was my mother's, then mine, and now it's yours. That's how it works. She put it in the small hands and closed them over it. There'll be a night you need a fire and no dry wood, and you'll want to have been the kind of person who put something by. Ivy looked at the pouch, then at her. What's it for? For the night you'll need it. Ivy held it in both hands the way Tully had held that first cup of coffee in the storm, against her chest, before she ever used it. Will you show me how? Every day this week, Hattie said, until you can do it in the dark with cold hands. That's the only way it counts. She taught her. It took 9 days. Ivy struck sparks into that charcloth every evening until she could get a coal on the second strike. Then on the first and the night she did it on the first strike, she looked up with a face so completely her father's that Hattie had to go see to the stove. She was 22 when she knew all of it. Sitting at the kitchen table in March, the snow still deep, but the light changed that late winter angle that is the only reliable sign of what is coming. Both children asleep. Carrick out in the barn with a lantern she could see through the window. She thought, this is my life. Not in the defeated way. Not the way people say it when they mean this is all I ended up with. The other way, the way of someone who has looked at what she built and can see it clear, warts and hard winters, and the grief that lives quiet alongside all of it. She had gone on to that outfit as a pair of hands no one remembered the name of. Widowed at 20 and broke and invisible. She was not invisible now. She heard the barn door. Boots on the frozen ground. The sound she knew by now, the same way she knew every sound on that place. He came in and stamped off and hung up his coat and looked at her at the table and then at the pot. Then he left. He poured a cup and sat down across from her. He looked at her book and did not ask about it. She didn't explain it. They sat there with the coffee and the quiet of a house where the children were sleeping and the snow was still down, but the light was changing. And Hattie Wray Carrick, who had been forgotten and invisible and alone, widowed before her life started, and had built one anyway out of dry cedar and stubborn hard sense, and the plain refusal to be less than what she was sat in that kitchen, and was. In the plain way of people who have earned it. Home. Not because anyone gave it to her. Not because anyone rescued her. Because she had shown up every single day and done the work. And stayed. That was all it had ever been. That was everything.